60 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, have the same conditions been created for another nuclear standoff? With Russia and the West facing off over Ukraine, there are fears that the world's two biggest nuclear arsenals could be put to use. We'll look at the parallels and lessons learned 6 decades after that frightening Cold War confrontation. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Cuban Missile Crisis. 60 years ago, the U.S. and the Soviet Union narrowly avoided nuclear warfare. In the summer of 1962, the U.S. discovered the Soviets were building nuclear missile sites on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles away from the U.S. mainland. Now, outright conflict was averted through careful Cold War negotiations, but 6 decades later, many are drawing parallels with the danger of that time, including the U.S. president. While talking about Russia's assault on Ukraine, Joe Biden said, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis." That warning last week set off alarm bells across the world, and reporters were quick to press the White House on what exactly the president meant.
So there's no imminent threat. I mean, there's no.
No, there is no. As I said before, we have not seen any reason to adjust our own strategic nuclear posture, nor do we have indication that Russia is preparing to imminently use nuclear weapons.
But what we have seen is Russia on the back foot in Ukraine, and President Vladimir Putin guaranteeing time and time again that all options are on the table.
If the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will without question use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff.
And while Putin's critics may downplay his threats as the dangerous ramblings of a madman, he's not the only one turning up the heat. The EU's foreign policy chief issued his own warning as well.
Any nuclear attack against Ukraine will create an answer. Not a nuclear answer, but such a powerful answer from the military side that the Russian army will be annihilated, and Putin should not be bluffing.
So the pressure is building on both sides of where the Iron Curtain once divided Europe. And on this anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, many a columnist are asking whether world leaders have learned from that important moment in history. How much does the dire rhetoric of 60 years ago resemble what we're hearing today?
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
Chilling words that resonate now more than ever, and joining me now to discuss their relevance as well as how real the risk of nuclear confrontation is, from Moscow, Viktor Olevich, a lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics, that's a Moscow-based think tank. From Washington, we have Andrew Danieri, an assistant director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, where he primarily focuses on Ukraine, Central Asia, and Russia. And from Madisonville, Louisiana, we have retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Rob Maness. He also authored the U.S.'s first nuclear war plan and has advised on deterrence strategies in Europe. Thanks all so much for being with us. Viktor, I'm going to start with you in Moscow first. I mean, in spite of, whatever rhetoric we've heard, in your opinion, how likely is it that Russia would actually deploy nuclear weapons to get what it wants in Ukraine?
Well, let's look at the possible scenarios. If the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south of Ukraine, in the Kherson region and in the Zaporozhye region, succeeds in the next few weeks before winter sets in, that would mean that a significant part of the territories that have now been incorporated into Russia would be officially under the control of the forces of the adversary, of the Ukrainian adversary, from the point of view of Moscow. Now, if you look at at Russia's official nuclear policy, one of the reasons the state can use nuclear weapons is in the presence of an existential threat to the territory of the Russian Federation.
And now
In that case,
Russia considers
it
the
is
territory it's
possible
annexed
that-
in eastern
that-
Ukraine
that-
as part of the Russian Federation now, correct? So you're saying it is on the table. I just want to make that
Well,
clear.
so essentially, at that point, Russia would be able to use tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Ukraine against Ukrainian military infrastructure. That the result of that would be catastrophic from the point of view of Russia's diplomatic efforts around the world. It would also create serious damage. It would seriously damage territories that Russia considers its own. But it would also possibly elicit a response, a military response from NATO, a non-nuclear military response from NATO. Now, if a non-nuclear military response from NATO forces is realized against Russian forces, then Russia would then not sit and wait for that to happen.
Okay.
Russia would respond against NATO forces.
Okay.
And that is a catastrophic scenario, both
Indeed
for
it is.
Moscow, for Washington, and for NATO capitals.
It's one that nobody wants, but I mean, Rob Maness, let me ask you, I mean, having heard that analysis, do you think we could reach, the confrontational heights of the Cuban Missile Crisis given the positions of both sides?
Well, considering the lack of inaction by the United States and NATO and their nuclear force posture, all the way from almost the beginning of the conflict when President Putin heightened the alert status of his nuclear forces, and we failed to respond except for with canceling a regularly scheduled ICBM readiness test that's supposed to demonstrate our capability to our potential adversaries and deter them. Once we didn't do that, and once we didn't change our posture to maintain parity with the Russian forces, deterrence started failing. And that's what's led us to this point right now, where we are at increased risk of a nuclear exchange, either between NATO and Russia at a tactical level, or even at the strategic level between the United States and Russia. And that would be catastrophic. As Viktor rightly pointed out, Russian strategy and tactics on their nuclear forces is to protect their territory, and they have claimed this territory both through the vote of the people in the territories, and now the Russian Duma has annexed that territory. So they will follow their tactics, and it could very well go down the wrong road. And unfortunately, with this weak president and weak NATO, we will not likely respond appropriately to prevent it.
I mean, you believe that the U.S. has actually failed to deter Russia in the way it could have. You criticize the U.S. for canceling, missile tests, and you say a general lack of preparedness, I think, that makes the U.S. look weak. But others argue that that kind of posturing actually helps de-escalate the situation by not posturing and getting nuclear capabilities at ready.
Andrea, we have over 80 years of experience in nuclear strategy and nuclear force use without having to use the weapons themselves. And that strategy says explicitly that weakness of one side towards the other gives that adversary in their mind the opportunity to use nuclear weapons without a response. And that is a very dangerous place to be. That is not brandishing by reaching parity with your nuclear force posture. That is what is called actual deterrence.
Let me ask Andrew if he agrees. I mean, has the U.S. essentially failed to deter Russia in a way that it could have had its preparedness been higher with its nuclear weapons arsenal?
Certainly, I agree. The West, and especially the U.S., failed even in February and before the conflict escalated, to deter Moscow from this full-scale invasion. And I think we're framing this in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I think even more instructive is we've seen over the past few months how Putin operates. He loves to rattle the nuclear saber, as it were, and this is his last card to play. This is his most serious card to play, is this kind of nuclear threat card. And we've seen this time and again, not only over the last few months, but over the last few years. And Putin now understands that, the West is now starting to be on to me to understand that Putin uses the threat of nukes to get what he wants and to undermine what would otherwise be strong Western deterrence. So I think hopefully now the West is catching on to this, and Putin certainly understands this, that his recent comments saying, I'm not bluffing on nukes, is actually a sign of weakness, that he understands that the West is more serious about deterring and responding to any Russian strike than it would have been 6 months ago or 8 years ago.
Okay. Andrew, I have to ask you this. I mean, yeah, there are some parallels, though, with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Unfortunately, the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis might not be one of them. At that time, there was a clear and relatively equal exchange made between the United States and the USSR to resolve the standoff. The U.S. removed medium-range missiles from Turkey, and the Soviet Union stopped advancing its positions in Cuba. Do those somewhat similar conditions exist today to any extent to de-escalate this, or is it far more complicated now?
Conditions are similar in that you have two of the strongest nuclear powers in the world as adversaries, the US and Russia today, and the US and the USSR back during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The key difference is that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was directly Russia, or excuse me, the Soviet Union pointing missiles at the US at the state of Florida, and the US did have missiles in Turkey as well. And there was kind of a logic to agreeing to both stand down there. Here today, this is Russia engaging in a genocidal war of choice in the heart of Europe, in Ukraine, and threatening to nuke Ukraine if Russia loses the war that it created. So those are kind of the key differences there. The US now today is supporting security in Europe and is supporting the right of Ukraine to exist as a state under threat from Moscow, existential threat, I should say.
Rob, I can't tell if you're laughing in disagreement or agreement because you feel it's an obvious point.
Well, Andrew's close to being correct, quite frankly, but let's get past the propaganda and the hyperbole and look at the facts. And the facts are that Russia was threatened in their near abroad, which is primarily Ukraine now, and the Soviet Union back in those days both maintained a nuclear force parity as one increased their level or decreased their levels of alert. The other did that too. And that enabled the statesmanship that resulted in the agreement that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the same conditions exist today. The United States and NATO have backed the Ukrainians to the point where Russia felt threatened, and we continue to not provide an opening for statesmanship to end this conflict and stop the killing on both sides. War is a terrible thing. I don't agree that President Putin sent his forces into Ukraine, but what I do think should be happening is a strong President of the United States get some courage and be a statesman.
Okay, I mean, Rob, I know you don't
warmonger
approve so much of President Biden, but I still fail to understand what you think is so wrong with the U.S., for example, providing weapons to Ukraine. I mean, do you think, the U.S. should have thrown Ukraine under the bus, even though it was reaching out to the West, which it feels has, a bond of democracy somehow with, and Europe as well? Were they supposed to just reject Ukraine go ahead?
The U.S. threw Ukraine under the bus in 2010 and then again in 2014 when it didn't respond. And as President Obama said, even then, and it still matters today, unfortunately, Ukraine is a vital interest to Russia, but not the United States of America. And that is why we are here today. And both sides are equally responsible. And it requires statesmanship to provide a solution for this. The continued killing on both sides is not going to end in any form that either Ukraine or Russia thinks it wants to end it as a strategic goal. And we need a statesman right now. And President Biden could do that, but he hasn't. He's been talking about Armageddon.
Very interesting. Victor, many an analyst had said, that Putin deploying nuclear weapons would be a disastrous decision. It seems like you agree with that to a certain extent. But we heard many an analyst also say that invading Ukraine would be a disastrous decision. yet we are where we are. So, do you have any insights into how we should fear or not fear this escalating to the point of actual nuclear conflict?
Well, there was an easy way to prevent this in 2014 if the United States and its European allies would not have supported the coup, the illegal, unconstitutional coup in Ukraine that ousted an elected leader, Viktor Yanukovych, whose election was recognized by Washington and NATO capitals. If a new government in 2014 would not have been supported by the West and supported in its anti-Russian stance, then none of this would have happened. Russia sees this, as has been correctly pointed out, as a threat, as a threat to itself. The presence of the Ukrainian anti-Russian stance is a threat to itself, and it essentially sees this as something that it will not be able to swallow. So, as far as the question of deterrence, at this point, there is nothing the United States can do to deter, because Russia is not willing to lose this military conflict, and it will do anything and everything in its power to force the United States into to the negotiating table. What Putin wants, what the Kremlin wants, is serious negotiations between Moscow and Washington on the future of Ukraine and on the future of NATO influence and NATO presence in the former Soviet Union.
Okay.
That is what Russia wants. And Russia openly said this for 3 months. For 3 months, it has been saying that for 3 months before this conflict erupted.
Okay, Andrew, I have to get your feelings on that statement. I mean, was it that clear that all Russia wanted was negotiations?
Not at all. And first, I'd like to go back to Victor's comments about 2014, that the Euromaidan movement was somehow a US-backed coup. Is absolute nonsense and has been proven time again to be nonsense. This is Ukrainian popular protests in Kyiv and elsewhere in the country, ousting a president peacefully, who then fired on protesters, kind of tried to decide where Ukraine wanted to be as a country. They did not want a closer future with Russia. They made their choice, and the US supported Ukrainians in their choice as a sovereign nation. And on the question of Russian negotiations with the US and elsewhere, in the run-up to the the February 24th escalation, the US and the OSCE and NATO gave Russia every opportunity to come to the negotiating table in good faith and to talk about how to de-escalate. The Russians declined to do that time and again. We saw the 2 draft treaties that the Kremlin sent to NATO, which were absolutely unacceptable. It required all NATO forces leaving Europe. It required Ukraine to never be in NATO, and essentially the US to grant Russia complete dominion over countries in Europe, which is unacceptable in any kind of security architecture. And even at the start of the war, Ukraine was ready to engage in negotiations with Russia, but the Kremlin again didn't take that seriously. Ukraine sent, in the first few weeks of the war, its top negotiators to meet with folks from the Kremlin. And who did Putin send? His top negotiators? No, he sent his culture minister. Not exactly who you want deciding these kinds of matters of war. And the fact of the matter is, until Putin is ready to sit down at the table and talk about leaving Ukraine, the threat of Putin invading Ukraine will always exist. So the fact that talking about US and Russia negotiations is certainly useful, but it must include Ukraine as well.
Andrew, quickly, and I'll put the same question to Rob Maness. Is there a risk here that Russia's now sheer frustration with failing to achieve what it wanted in the last 7 months, could it lead the Kremlin to take more extreme measures in order to finish this conflict?
This absolutely is a risk, and this is a risk because Putin has put himself in an untenable position. He is losing this war currently, and it's becoming less and less popular in Russia. So Putin's own survival in the Kremlin depends on winning this war. So yes, the risk of escalation has increased because Putin has lost control of the war and it's become existential for him.
Rob Maness, do you agree there?
Oh, absolutely it is, but it's primarily because the West and the United States remain flat-footed in their nuclear force posture and have no way of credibly deterring Mr. Putin in the use of tactical or strategic nuclear weapons at this point. And we have to come to the table as statesmen, and that's going to require a statesman. You know, back when the USSR still existed, it took a Ronald Reagan president to get the courage to go to the table and talk from a position of strength instead of a position of weakness. And right now, the West shows its weakness and we're flat footed. And that puts us in a very dangerous spot because Mr. Putin, as Andrew said, is weak, is continued threatening to use nuclear weapons on Ukraine, shows that weakness, and the war is not going that well for him. And he will do whatever it takes to survive.
Okay, let me ask a little bit more, Victor, then about potential deterrence, which Rob seems to feel have failed entirely via U.S. policy. But still, the EU says if Russia deploys nuclear weapons, there will be an answer, though it will not be a nuclear one. Still, they will annihilate, quoting them, annihilate the Russian army. So if not by nuclear weapons, does Russia still feel threatened and somehow arguably deterred by the threat that they could hit Russia's nuclear installations with tactical weapons in full force?
Well, you do understand that all of these scenarios have been modeled by Russian general staff, by the British, American, and European general staffs. So obviously, if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and if there is a NATO military non-nuclear response against the Russian army in Ukraine or anywhere outside, then obviously Russia would respond militarily then against NATO countries. What would be the result of all of this? Negotiations. So this is not about morals. It's about geopolitics. The negotiations that were held before February were not successful. The United States and their NATO allies were not willing to give anything serious up in Ukraine. So now Russia has a different position in the negotiations. It's offering negotiations at this point where it controls large wastelands in Ukraine. The United States and NATO countries are not willing to negotiate again. So Russia is going to obviously escalate up to the point where the United States and their NATO allies are going to be forced to negotiate, because the catastrophic scenario that we are discussing here today, will force both sides at some point to negotiate, because nobody wants mutual destruction, complete mutual destruction.
Yeah.
But it is better to negotiate now than to negotiate after catastrophic events of that magnitude happen.
Fair enough. Let me get to Andrew. We only have 2 minutes left, and I want to get your final thoughts then, because I could see you had a response to what you heard.
Absolutely. Well, Victor, the issue with that kind of order of operations in terms of negotiations is if, like you say, if Putin uses a tactical nuclear strike in Ukraine, the West or NATO countries then respond non-nuclear but in a conventional way and destroy the Russian army, and then we go to negotiations, it's Russia who will be in a much weaker position than the West because its entire army will be destroyed. So it actually...
But Russia could respond in a nuclear way. What would happen then? Because there's no way that conventional weapons...
that none of Putin's posturing and nuclear threats are actually in their interest. This is only in the interest of Putin. Russians and Russia will be in a much weaker position in negotiations and in real terms if Putin opts to use a nuclear strike in Ukraine.
Rob, I can give you 1 minute, please. Your quick final thoughts, because I could see you found some of it laughable.
There's three issues here. The EU doesn't have an armed force that it has the capability of sending into any country. Number two, NATO has been feckless all along. The primary player on the European ground in NATO is Germany, and they continue to be feckless in providing weapons and arms and those kinds of things to the Ukrainians. And three, the United States has not declared war on Russia. And if the United States commander-in-chief tries to attack Russia for attacking a country that is not in our vital national interest, the people of the United States are going to be letting that person know, and the Congress is going to let that person know. And it takes a vote of Congress for us to go to war against the country. And we haven't had that vote, and it won't happen.
Okay, Rob Maness, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank Viktor Olevich and Andrew Danieri as well for being with us on this fascinating edition of The Newsmakers. Thanks so much to the three of you, as well to our viewers, of course. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.